Lifestyle beer ads. Do they help put young people in wheelchairs? Some disabled people say yes. Hello and welcome to DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin. There's been a lot of controversy surrounding beer advertising on television recently. We'll find out what some members of the disabled community think about the commercials and whether disabled groups should take money from the industry. We'll also meet the first deaf person to be elected president of the Canadian Hearing Society. And with Christmas just around the corner, we'll hear from a toy maker who doesn't make her toys out of plastic. First, here's this week's roundup of disability news. A parliamentary committee has criticized the federal government's response to the committee's report calling for the economic integration of disabled persons. The All-Party Committee on Human Rights and the Status of the Disabled issued the report, A Consensus for Action, last June. When Secretary of State Jerry Weiner responded to the report last month, there was concern that little was being proposed to help achieve economic integration. Last Monday, Committee Chairman Bruce Halliday tabled an unprecedented criticism of the government's response.
The committee's unanimous view, Mr. Speaker, is that the government response, while it contains worthwhile initiatives, is not a truly comprehensive response.
It's the first time a parliamentary committee has issued a report criticizing the government's response. But Halliday says the move was necessary.
What we feel is missing, though, is the commitment and the details and the specificity that we feel should be there. By making that kind of commitment to us, then we feel that the people out in the community, the disabled people of Canada, would know what to expect, as would we know what to expect, and we'd know when to expect these changes that need to be made. Right now, although they have made the commitment, they're not commitments in terms of time. For example, we feel there should be reasonable accommodation in the workplace for people who are disabled. They agree to that, but we've been waiting now for several years to have that brought in by the government by way of an amendment, perhaps, to the Human Rights Act, and we're still waiting for it. We want to know when they're going to do that.
An annual report tabled in Parliament this week shows disabled persons falling behind in hiring by federal employers. The report prepared by Employment and Immigration Canada shows they made up 2.3% of the federally regulated workforce. But that increase was due to a larger percentage of employees identifying themselves as disabled, not by increases in the workforce. The practice is especially prevalent in the banking industry and has been criticized by disability organizations. The report covers over 600,000 employees in federally regulated fields such as transportation, banking, and telecommunications. Disabled persons in Regina are protesting provincial cutbacks in accessible transit. They're angry about the province's decision to freeze the money it pays for the service. Dean Gutiel reports.
A parade of angry disabled people and their friends marched the legislature.
No more cuts! We want the bus!
They came here to protest January 1st cuts to disabled busing. For years, the province and the city split the cost of special needs busing. That amounts to about $1.3 million a year. The city says it will pay its half next year, but the province says it can't afford to pick up all of its share. It says the rising number of seniors riding the buses has pushed costs up too high. A 1991 funding freeze means evening and weekend busing for the disabled will be cut back.
No more cuts! We want the bus!
After demonstrating for 20 minutes, the Minister for Family emerged. Martin said the province is looking at cheaper ways to transport seniors and keep busing costs down. Finally, Martin brought the protesters inside to talk, but little was resolved.
I'm pleading with the city of Regina and Doreen Hamilton, who's a councillor, to please don't reduce your service for the time being until we can resolve some of these problems.
We have our
and they have.
up front. We need the 50% from the province.
Don't reduce the service to me.
Well, I'm pleading with you, Beattie. These people have been reviewed to death.
And the protesters left just as angry as when they arrived.
I suspect I'll be sitting at home when I want to be someplace else having a turkey dinner. I won't be able to get there because there won't be a bus. That's what I suspect.
Dean Gutiel, CBC News, Regina.
Diabetic natives in the north have special problems which aren't being addressed by existing programs. That according to a spokesperson for the Canadian Diabetic Association. Jill Christensen of the association's Northwest Territories branch says most of the more than 400 diabetics in her area are natives. Christensen says there is very little help available for natives coping with the disease.
I think that as far as treatment goes, and this is one of the situations that our association is now trying to work on, is that a lot of the materials and programs that are now available and in use don't apply to the Northern lifestyle. This is probably the biggest hurdle that we have to face. Materials are not available in the Aboriginal languages, and don't probably take into consideration the use of traditional foods and traditional living situations. As far as prevention goes, I think because of a change in lifestyle, a change in eating habits, a change in activity, that one of the results has been the onset of more diseases that weren't seen in the past.
Next week, we'll bring you a special program focusing on Natives and disability. And that's this week's roundup of disability news. Coming up, one too many for the road. A coroner's jury in Toronto has recommended that advertising of alcoholic beverages be banned from TV. The recommendation follows an inquest which examined the death of James Whiffen, a 15-year-old boy who drank nearly a bottle of liquor and died of alcohol poisoning. It also comes at a time when people who make and sell rum, whiskey, gin, and other hard liquor are trying to get on TV. The Canadian Distillers Association says it wants to broadcast public service announcements such as, "If you drink, don't drive." The association has told the CRTC that it should be allowed to join beer companies on the air.
When you see what we've got playing in the 90s, it'll make your head spin.
And spinning profits is the main concern of the beer companies and television stations and networks that run the beer commercials. If you believe the commercials, beer and sports are synonymous. And what do the boys look forward to at the end of a fishing trip on some beautiful northern lake? You guessed it, beer. No evening out for the plugged-in young set seems complete. No door to sexual conquest will open. Not even a good time can be had without beer.
Ham looks over the middle and it's intercepted.
The Grey Cup is brought to us by the CFL, the television networks, and a beer company. Then there's hockey. One beer company owns the Montreal Canadiens and has a major stake in the Toronto Maple Leafs. And beer and a baseball are inseparable twins. Look at the stands, the Jumbotron, and above all, the boardroom. The ballet, the opera, the theater welcomes beer company support. Why, even one of Toronto's culture palaces, the O'Keefe Centre, was named after a beer in the days when you couldn't advertise beer on television. One group that has members opposed to alcohol advertising is the Head Injury Association of Toronto, Hyatt. Many of them are disabled as a result of alcohol-related injuries, and often the injured person is the innocent party involved in an accident, the person who hasn't been drinking. Earlier, 3 members of the association told me why they were opposed to alcohol advertising. Esther Vetter is the information coordinator for Hyatt. Mark Thistle was in a coma for 29 days due to an alcohol-related incident. He's now legally blind, and he still has seizures. And Peter Roberts uses a wheelchair. 6 years ago, he was injured when he left work late one night from his summer job at the Holiday Inn in Vancouver.
A drunk driver did as many do, went through a red light, and that ended my active life at 22 years.
How has this affected your life?
In every way, it has affected my life and my family's as well.
Mr. Thistle, tell me your story.
Well, I was in a bar and I had a few drinks, quite a few drinks, and I left and I accidentally picked up the change that was beside me, and it was a fella that was standing beside me, and he was at the phone. He came back, he assumed it was mine, stormed out after me. He assumed that I stole it, I'm sorry. Stormed out, and then jumped me from behind and just kicked me repeatedly in the head and beat me quite badly, and then left, ran away.
Had that individual been drinking?
Yes, he was quite impaired, much more than I was.
How do you feel about liquor and beer advertising on television?
I'm really against it. I really feel that the youth is our largest audience that watches TV, and I really do feel that even the beer ads do give a very false impression about alcohol. And to me, these ads portray a good life, a party time, when actually what the ads do not show is that quite often, due to the drinking, innocent people's lives are affected. And I always say those lives, even though the person does survive the injuries, their lives are altered. Their lives are never the same.
Mr. Thistle, how do you react to advertising that's on television around beer and wine and liquor?
It certainly affects the attitude of the consumer if they're going to see it's a great time. And well, I mean, it is false and it's misleading. There's no doubt about that. They don't show both sides of the problem. Of course, they couldn't, because then they wouldn't sell the product. I feel with them saying that they're going to show public service, don't drink and drive, because you'll end up hurting somebody or killing somebody. The police say don't drink and drive, kind of thing. They're not going to push it as much as they push the opposite side of the advertising. They won't show both sides 50-50. They'll show 95% of their product and 5% please don't drink and drive.
What's your message to the CRTC?
Well, my message is they should show both sides, the hospitals, fellows like Peter and myself that have sustained life-shattering injuries, jail cells, of course. The courts are just filled with people that were so drunk they did something so stupid besides drinking and driving. I mean, other family violence. And just, it's crazy what goes on. And alcohol is such an unstable substance. It's like TNT.
That interview was recorded earlier. Joining me now is Howard Collins. He's the Director of Communications for the Brewers Association of Canada. Mr. Collins, as we've just seen, some of the people with head injuries are disabled because of alcohol-related injuries. They'd like to see all liquor advertising banned from television. What do you think of that?
It's always a tragedy when somebody is hurt in any sort of accident. I don't think in this case that banning advertising would have an impact on the accident rate or on the seriousness of the accidents. I think that there are extensive studies which show that advertising does not promote misuse of the product. I think what we ought to be doing is focusing on those things that we think will be effective.
Do you think that the current lifestyle advertising is misleading, though?
I don't think so. Advertising really mirrors society. I think over the years we have seen changes in advertising, and I think we will see further changes in that it is a dynamic. Standards change, society changes, and that's generally reflected in advertising.
What does your association do to promote responsible drinking?
In terms of promoting responsible drinking, the industry as a total, including my association and the individual member companies, spend upwards of $10 million a year. That includes radio and television advertising, print advertising, educational programs, and indeed basic research. We fund with the U.S. Brewers the Alcoholic Beverage Medical Research Foundation, where we're doing basic research into the causes of alcohol problems.
Mr. Collins, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Howard Collins is the Director of Communication for the Brewers Association of Canada. We also asked somebody from the Canadian Distillers Association to appear on the program, but they declined. There is another twist to the connection between disability associations and beer companies. While members of the Head Injury Association of Toronto feel that beer and alcohol advertising does a lot of harm, other groups like the Easter Seal Society have been working with beer companies. Here's a commercial linked to their latest campaign.
The cold has come, so soon they'll come to this place to chase a puck, maybe chase a dream. But mostly, they'll come just to play. Every kid needs to play. To be a kid, Easter Seals delivers.
This season, Molson Canadian and Canadian Light will donate a portion of sales, $300,000, to Easter Seals.
If you're out this season, please take care.
Ed Hackinson is the chairman of the Fundraising Action Committee for the Easter Seal Society. He says the society has been working together with Molson's for a long time. Bearing in mind the fact that many disabilities are brought about by drinking, I asked him if he had any reservations about the relationship.
No, none at all. And the main reason for that, and why I can say that so explicitly, is again, because of our history with Molson's and Molson's history with us. But the other thing is you have to appreciate that our caseload is based on children. It's based on from infancy to 19 years of age. And that caseload, I am unaware of any problem caused by alcohol-related or beer-related problems that's ever been brought to me. That doesn't mean, of course, that we can't sympathize with it, and we understand that there's awareness and a role of everybody in society, not just Easter Seals and not just you or I, but we all have a job to do in doing things in moderation and to keep things going that says whatever you do, make sure you do it in moderation and don't go overboard.
We at DNET took an informal poll of other disability organizations. The Canadian Paraplegic Association, the March of Dimes, and the Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus Association all found nothing wrong with beer company sponsorship. Even the Ontario Head Injury Association was not opposed, unlike our guest from the Head Injury Association of Toronto. After this break, we'll meet the Canadian Hearing Society's first deaf president. We are now going to meet a role model. Catherine Woodcock is the first deaf person to be elected president of the Canadian Hearing Society. Our story begins right here at the CBC.
Deaf students in Ontario say they're not getting a fair deal in education, and today they marched on the provincial legislature to demand change. The issue is communication. The deaf want to be taught in their own language. They say that's not happening right now, not in Ontario or any other province. Cass Rusi reports.
About 300 deaf protesters and their supporters beat the drum on a wet afternoon in Toronto for the right to equal...
Deaf and hearing impaired Canadians are getting to be very good at attracting media attention. Television in particular has given a lot of airtime to the demands of deaf people for a better, more independent life. The public demonstration has been a particularly effective tool in bringing the needs of deaf and hearing impaired persons to the attention of government and the public at large. One deaf person who is clearly mistress of her own house is Catherine Woodcock, the first deaf president of the Canadian Hearing Society. Woodcock, who has become progressively deaf, says she is not frightened by the world of the deaf.
I don't find the deaf world a frightening thing at all. A lot of hearing people say, oh, being deaf must be the worst thing in the world. It's the worst possible disability you could have. Maybe I'm naive, but it's almost kind of fun for me. I mean, I have finally found a world that is accessible to me. The way that the deaf community communicates is accessible to me after years of trying to get into the hearing world and make my way through the hearing world. And now I find that the deaf community communicates in a way that matches my abilities, and that's not frightening for me, that's liberating.
In your efforts and accomplishments,
a professional engineer, Catherine Woodcock is receiving a scholarship that will enable her to continue her university studies. It was in May of 1990 that she was elected by the Canadian Hearing Society as its first deaf president.
I think the most important thing I can do, I mean, this is fairly early in my term as president, but I think the most important thing I can do is be, for want of a better word, a role model to show people that there's nothing exceptional about a deaf person being the president of the society. It's perfectly possible, it's plausible, and it's effective. A meeting can be chaired that involves both deaf and hard of hearing and hearing people, can be chaired by someone using sign language, and that other people will understand what's going on in the meeting perfectly well, that the due rules of order can be followed, motions can be made and seconded, and minutes taken. So it's sort of a model in that respect, and that other consumers can look at that and say, well, if she can do it, I can do it.
These are students from Washington's University for the Deaf, Gallaudet. 2 years ago, in an action that attracted worldwide attention, Gallaudet students successfully campaigned for the election of the university's first deaf president.
I think that the deaf people at Gallaudet weren't asking for somebody's endorsement to say yes or no, could a deaf person do it? They knew a deaf person could do it, and now they wanted the recognition that a deaf person could do it. So within the Gallaudet community, it had its value, but in the larger deaf community, it also said, if they're listening at Gallaudet, what else can we do?
The Speaker is pleased to recognize the member for York East.
I am truly honored and privileged to move the adoption of the speech from the throne.
As significant in some ways as the Gallaudet Revolution was the election to the Ontario legislature of Gary Malkowski. And there, aiding Malkowski was his interpreter, something that had never happened before in a Canadian legislature.
Now we have in the Ontario legislature a deaf person representing the needs of hearing people. That's what we want to see. We want to see the needs of deaf people being represented by deaf people, the needs of hard of hearing people being represented by hard of hearing people. And we want the hearing community to look at that and say, it's legitimate for us to represent our own interests. Only we know our real needs, and only we can advocate effectively for our own interests.
Coming up, the personal touch. Ten years ago, Henny Sager's muscular dystrophy took a turn for the worse. At the same time, she was asked to manage a toy show. The experience gave her a new lease on life. She went on to work at other toy shows, but shortly after found that she preferred making the toys herself. For Henny Sager, creating a child's toy is not just a matter of putting together two pieces of wood with glue and nails. To her, it's a form of art. She puts endless hours into her work as she carefully crafts each piece and then adds vibrant colors. Unlike what you would find from an assembly line, Sager says these are what toys are all about.
This is the kind of toys, and I really find most of the things I make and I paint are whimsicals, and they have to make you laugh or giggle, even if they have a message. I mean, you can see the ones, you know, the running chick with the 5 leg. Obviously, I never thought about it, but it probably has to do with me also, because, I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if I have 5 legs to run around? So I think sometimes unconscious, you create something which, of course, relates to you, because that's what you are all about. And again, the positive factor is that there's so much ugliness in the world and so much depressing things that I don't think I want to contribute more to it.
As for how children respond to the toys, Sager feels kids actually prefer these toys to those that can be purchased at any store.
Whenever I lecture, I always say the first piece of art is in a child's hand, and it's a toy, and it should be a piece of art. It should be a piece of sculpture. It should be something very beautiful to stimulate all the senses. And I'm sorry, but you cannot get it from a piece of plastic, you know, or a toy which it just does something when it has a battery, you know. I call them the dead toys. You don't get that out of a toy like that. Which these ones you can feel, you can touch, you have a sensation when you look at them. It's a very different thing.
If you'd like more information on what toys are available or where, just drop us a line and we'll pass along your request. Our address is the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. And that's our show for this week, except for this pre-Christmas reminder.
I was at La Party, graciously sharing La Cocktail Shrimpy, when along came La Girl of My Dreams. So I offered her La Beer and La Drive. Now she is La Quad.
I'm Joe Coughlin. Join us next week when we'll be bringing you a special on natives and disability.